Greetings, History of Sexuality students. This is Professor Bowen here with the second of the week's lectures on the American gay rights movement. Previously in class, we saw how the 1960s and 70s gave rise to a variety of social movements which collectively aimed to root out sexism, racism, and other forms of systemic oppression within the United States. Among those seeking to build a more inclusive society were gays and lesbians, who banded together, took to the streets, and rose up in protest against discriminatory laws, policies, and everyday behaviors that stigmatized, pathologized, and criminalized their very existences. All throughout this period, gay rights groups publicly advocated for things like the repeal of laws that prohibited them from gaining public sector employment, the decriminalization of homosexual relationships, and the demedicalization of homosexuality itself. Without a doubt, one of the most important spurs to gay rights activism was the Stonewall Riots of 1969, but as we saw, the gay rights movement actually predates this, reaching back to the 1950s. In the aftermath of the Second World War, organizations like the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis emerged, and their campaign to promote greater acceptance of and tolerance for homosexuality brought them into dialogue with the American Psychiatric Association, or APA for short, whose members were widely regarded as experts on homosexuality. Eventually, this engagement with the APA led to one of the most important moments in the history of gay liberation, the deletion of homosexuality from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM. This momentous event, which occurred in 1973, meant that the APA would no longer regard homosexuality as a mental disorder. So, how did this come to pass? What prompted the APA to remove homosexuality from the DSM? And to what extent did this bring about the depathologization and destigmatization of homosexuality? Lastly, what were the consequences of the decision for gays and lesbians, and what does it tell us about sexuality in the late 20th century United States? In what follows, we'll address all these questions, examining both the causes and the consequences of the APA's 1973 decision. As we learned in our last class, during the early 1950s, many homophile activists regarded psychiatrists as allies in the struggle against homophobia. But as the decade progressed, things changed. In part, this owed to the increasingly negative views of homosexuality aired by members of the psychiatric profession. For example, in his 1956 book Homosexuality, Disease or Way of Life, psychiatrist Edmund Bergler openly attacked gays and lesbians, calling them injustice collectors who deliberately sought out suffering and were untrustworthy troublemakers. In response to this, an article in The Ladder denounced Bergler, contending that instead of being miserable souls, there were, quote, countless homosexuals who, instead of being miserable souls, lead lives that are happy, stable, productive, rich in achievement, devoid of obsessive and paralyzing conflicts. With the passage of time, denunciations of psychiatry became more and more common. In its 1958 anniversary issue, for example, the Mattachine Review claimed that the concept of homosexuality as a disease is unacceptable. Cure now became anathema, and self-acceptance was increasingly the Mattachines' preferred approach. By 1964, it was clear that many within this society would no longer accept the idea that homosexuals were sick. Leading the charge in these years was Frank Kameny, president of the Mattachine Society of Washington, D.C. Ushering the Mattachines into a more militant phase of existence, Kameny argued that homosexuality was no less normal than heterosexuality. He called the idea that homosexuality was a disease a, quote, theological position. Rejecting the homophile movement's traditional deference to science, Kameny declared that we, as gays, are the true authorities on homosexuality. He argued that his fellow activists needed to partake of the kinds of tactics being wielded by black civil rights activists. He said, "We would be foolish not to recognize what the Negro rights movement has shown us is sadly so. Mere persuasion, information, and education are not going to gain for us in actual practice the rights and equality which are ours in principle." The era of gay liberation was at hand. With this, the era of lobbying and litigation came to an end, and the era of marching, protesting, disrupting, and picketing began. Militantly opposing psychiatric power, gay rights groups began to interfere with medical association meetings featuring lectures by anti-gay psychiatrists, demanding that their own views be given equal attention. By 1970, things had come to a head. In that year, gay activists traveled to San Francisco to protest the annual APA convention. Regularly disrupting the proceedings, the presence of gay activists convinced the association's leaders to change the format of this annual meeting. In 1971, for the first time, APA leaders organized a panel discussion at which gay men and women were given an opportunity to publicly challenge the authority of psychiatrists. In his own speech, Frank Kameny declared that, quote, "Psychiatry is the enemy incarnate. Psychiatry has waged a relentless war of extermination against us. You may take this as a declaration of war." In his own speech, another gay activist named Larry Littlejohn declared as follows, "I think the homosexual lifestyle, for those people who want to live it, is beautiful, and I think it should be appreciated. For many people, hundreds of thousands of people, it is a valid, healthy lifestyle." It was at this meeting that activists first proposed the idea of reconsidering the diagnostic status of homosexuality. At the 1972 meeting in Dallas, there was also a strong, organized gay presence. One of the most fascinating things about the 1972 meeting was the testimony of a Dr. Anonymous, who declared that, quote, "I am a homosexual. I am a psychiatrist." After informing his audience that there were more than 200 gay psychiatrists attending the convention, he went on to state the following. "As psychiatrists who are homosexual, we must know our place and what we must do to be successful. If our goal is high academic achievement, a level of earning capacity equal to our fellows, or admission to a psychoanalytic institute, we must make sure that we behave ourselves and that no one in a position of power is aware of our sexual preference and or gender identity. Much like a black man with white skin who chooses to live as a white man, we can't be seen with our real friends, our real homosexual family, lest our secret be known and our doom sealed. Those who are willing to speak out openly will do so only if they have little to lose, and if you have little to lose, you won't be listened to." At this point, it appeared that views were starting to change. A reevaluation of homosexuality was underway within the profession, and increasingly, more and more doctors came to believe that their own views on this were being impacted by biased, unscientific heterosexual biases. It was in this environment that Robert Spitzer, a member of the APA's Committee on Nomenclature, circulated a draft document called Homosexuality as an Irregular Form of Sexual Development and Sexual Orientation Disturbance as a Psychiatric Disorder. As a result of discussions with gay activists, Spitzer had come to believe that many gays and lesbians were in fact fully satisfied with their sexual orientations. His document was an attempt to stake out an intermediate position between those who thought that homosexuality was a normal variant and those who thought that it was thoroughly pathological. To do so, he argued that while those who found their homosexuality troubling might be suffering from a psychiatric disorder, others who had no problems with this were entirely healthy. Thus, Spitzer recommended a new classification of sexual orientation disturbance to stand in for the now deleted homosexuality. His draft statement declared, "This category is for individuals whose sexual interests are directed primarily toward people of the same sex and who are either bothered by, in conflict with, or wish to change their sexual orientation. This diagnostic category is distinguished from homosexuality, which by itself does not constitute a psychiatric disorder. Homosexuality per se is a form of irregular sexual development, and like other forms of irregular sexual development, which are not themselves psychiatric disorders, is not listed in this nomenclature of mental disorders." Such a position would accomplish multiple goals and hopefully ensure widespread support. While removing the label of mental illness from homosexuals, it would also protect those doctors who sought, through clinical intervention, to assist those who wanted to seek heterosexual adjustment. So here, homosexuality might be suboptimal, but it was not a disease or disorder. After considering Spitzer's resolution, the council voted unanimously in favor of it, and months later, the membership of the APA formally approved Spitzer's resolution, although 37% opposed it. As the vote on Spitzer's resolution suggests, the APA's 1973 decision did not mean that all psychiatrists stopped thinking that homosexuality was pathological. A 1977 survey published in a prominent medical journal found that the majority of psychiatric practitioners continued to believe that homosexuality might be a mental illness. Only 5% believed that homosexuality was a normal variant. In this same survey, 60% of respondents declared that homosexual men were less capable of mature, loving relationships than heterosexuals. And 70% believed that the problems experienced by homosexuals were more due to personal conflicts than stigma. As this suggests, despite the momentous victory that was 1973, the pathological view of homosexuality continued to prevail. In part, it did so because America's social climate was becoming more conservative. The radical civil rights and reformist energies of the 1960s and early 70s were now starting to dissipate, and in their place came a backlash against some of the victories of that era. Perhaps reflecting this, a new version of the DSM released in 1980 included a new term, ego-dystonic homosexuality. The latter was defined as, quote, a desire to acquire or increase heterosexual arousal so that heterosexual relations can be initiated or maintained, and a sustained pattern of overt homosexual arousal that the individual explicitly complains is unwanted as a source of distress. The final revisions to the DSM-III provided some additional clarity on this new concept of ego-dystonic homosexuality, stating that, quote, since homosexuality itself is not considered a mental disorder, the factors that predispose to homosexuality are not included in this section. The factors that predispose to ego-dystonic homosexuality are negative societal attitudes toward homosexuality, which have been internalized. In addition, features associated with heterosexuality, such as having children and socially sanctioned family life, may be viewed as desirable and incompatible with a homosexual arousal pattern. While homosexuality itself was removed from the DSM's categories of mental disorder, distress over homosexuality was not removed. Indeed, this gained new power in DSM-III. So it is clear that despite the APA's reversal on homosexuality, this was nevertheless still viewed as irregular, suboptimal, and potentially pathological. Such attitudes fed into a growing backlash against homosexuality that took on new momentum in the 1980s, when a new sexually transmitted disease began to ravage gay men's health all across the U.S. That disease was AIDS, and in our final week of the course, we'll consider the way the American gay community responded to this. But before we get there, let's reflect some more on gay liberation and the struggle against the APA.